The morning they meant to kill her, the sky did not trouble itself with color. It remained the gray of old ash, of exhausted things, the gray of a world that had already decided the outcome and saw no reason to dress it in ceremony. The platform had been built overnight. Thessaly could smell the fresh-cut wood beneath the frost, the sap not yet dried, as though even the timber was new to death and had not learned to hide it. She stood at the center of the Ironhollow courtyard in her commoner's dress, muted brown-gray, worn at the hem, clean. Her pale hair hung loose. They had not bound it. Perhaps they thought it a mercy. Perhaps they simply had not thought of her at all. The charge had been read at dawn. She had not spoken during the reading. She had not spoken when the High Alpha raised his hand for silence. She had not spoken when the executioner took his position, when the assembled court of 3 packs arranged itself in its careful hierarchy of witnesses, when the priest completed his words and stepped back with his eyes already elsewhere. She said nothing. The axe was raised. And 3 kingdoms away in the fens of Ashmore, in the mountain passes of Caldrath, in the salt marshes at the border of the Thornward wolves, woke from deep sleep with their mouths open and no sound coming out. Their hearts beating wrong, their eyes seeing nothing but pale hair and gray sky and the particular stillness of a woman who knows something the rest of the world does not. The axe fell, and it was not the end. It was the beginning. If this story already has its grip on you, you belong here. Welcome to Judy's Romance Library. Subscribe so the truth finds you. Now, let us continue. Chapter 1. The Weight of a Borrowed Name. 3 days before they brought her to the platform, Thessaly copied legal records by the light of a tallow candle that had already burned past the hour it was allotted. The records room sat at the back of the Ironhollow Administrative Hall, a long, low-ceilinged space that smelled of ink and damp stone, and the particular staleness of documents that had not been opened since the men who wrote them were still alive. She worked here because no other position was available to a packless woman of 23, with no wolf, no bloodline on record, and no sponsor within the hierarchy. The position was called Records Assistant. What it meant, in practice, was that Thessaly sat in the cold and copied in neat hand whatever the record keeper, a man named Aldis, found too tedious to manage himself. Aldis was not cruel to her. He was something worse, indifferent. She had worked beside him for 4 years, and he had never learned to say her name correctly. Thessaly, she had told him once, gently. The second syllable is soft. He had looked at her the way people looked at mist, aware of it, faintly inconvenienced by it, already forgetting it. Yes, he had said, and gone back to his work. She did not correct him again. Ironhollow was not a cruel pack by the standards of the Northern Territories. It fed its packless, housed them in the lower quarters, allowed them work of the kinds that mattered little. It did not chain them or mark them. It simply arranged the world so that they were always at the edge of things, always visible enough to be useful, never close enough to belong. The hierarchy was old. Pack-born wolves at the top, ranked by wolf strength and bloodline. Halves those with wolf blood but no shift in the middle. Packless humans and the wolfless at the bottom, tolerated as long as they were quiet. The law that governed this arrangement had not been revised in living memory. Thessaly had read every version of it. There was nothing to revise. The council had decided 3 terms ago. The structure works as it is. She had written that down because it was her job to write things down. She had not permitted herself to feel anything about it. Feeling, in Ironhollow, was a luxury belonging to those whose feelings were considered worth addressing. It was on the 3rd evening of the month that Elder Fenwick came into the records room. He was a broad man, built wide as a barn door, with silver streaking through his dark beard and the slow certainty of movement that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. He did not knock. The packless did not require that courtesy. He walked in as though the room belonged to him, which by any operational measure of Ironhollow law, It did. He was looking for a deed, a land transfer from the founding generation, he told Aldous, who immediately began a performance of frantic searching through the wrong drawers. Thessaly found it in 11 seconds. She knew where every document in this room lived. She had memorized the catalog the first week she arrived because she had quickly learned that Aldous was frequently wrong about what was where, and that when documents went missing under his supervision, the fault was assigned to the assistant. She set the deed on the table without comment. Elder Fenwick picked it up, scanned it, grunted with satisfaction. Then he looked at her not unkindly, but with the mild, removed interest of a man noting a piece of furniture that had proved more useful than expected. "Is this the mad woman's daughter?" he asked Aldous. The candle flame bent as though the room had briefly inhaled. Aldous looked uncomfortable. "Her name is Thessaly. She assists with—" "I know who she assists." Fenwick returned his gaze to the deed, already done with her. Thought she'd have more of the look about her. The mother had that look. "You'll remember it if you were old enough. That blank stare, like she was listening to something no one else could hear." He left with his document. The door closed. Aldous looked at Thessaly with the expression of a man who would very much like to say something comforting and has not yet identified what that thing might be. "It is all right," Thessaly said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I have the Veldmark transfer to finish before close of day." She turned back to her work. She did not tremble. She did not let the elder's words open the particular room in her chest where she kept her mother, kept the memory of a woman who had sat in a courtyard very like this one 16 years ago, while a council of men decided what her hearing of prayers meant about her fitness to remain among the living. Her mother had not been mad. Thessaly had known that since she was 7 years old. She had kept knowing it for 16 years with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a truth that has no audience but does not require one. She uncapped her ink. She continued to copy. On the desk before her, the Veldmark transfer was a standard document, boundaries, signatures, witness marks. But as her pen moved across the page, her eyes caught a notation in the margin. Small, in the cramped hand of a record-keeper 3 generations dead, a reference to a deed of forfeiture. The name attached to the forfeiture had been partially obscured by water damage. The remaining letters spelled Sally. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she covered it with the edge of her sleeve and continued her work. She noted the shelf, the drawer, the position of the document. She did not reach for it, not yet. She had learned patience the way others learned to walk early, out of necessity, and so thoroughly that she barely noticed she was doing it. Chapter 2. The charge requires a name. The trial was held in the Great Hall of the Ironhollow Administrative Complex, which was designed for exactly this sort of occasion. High ceilings, stone benches, arranged in a horseshoe around the raised council dais, torches set at intervals that cast the room in amber and shadow. It had the feeling of a place that had staged many verdicts and intended to stage many more. Thessaly was brought in under escort of 2 pack guards at the 2nd hour after dawn. She had been given no notice of the trial until the morning it occurred. The summons had been slipped under the door of her room in the lower quarters at first light, unsigned, with the charge written in the formal language of Ironhollow law. Spiritual contamination. Practice or suspected practice of pre-accord rites in violation of the Ironhollow Consolidation Edict, 3rd generation. She had read it twice. She had washed her face. She had dressed in her cleanest dress, the muted gray-brown, worn at the hem. She had eaten nothing, because there was nothing left from the previous night, and she had not wanted to ask. She had walked to the hall with the guards, and she had not asked them anything either. The hall was full. This surprised her. She had expected a council preceding 7 members, a secretary, perhaps a witness or 2. Instead, the stone benches were packed with wolves of all rank, pack-borne in their formal colors near the front, halves behind them, a scattering of packless near the back, standing because the benches had filled before they were permitted entry. She understood, then, that this was not a proceeding. It was a demonstration. The High Alpha, Caerun Valdis, sat at the center of the council dais. He was a tall man, perhaps 40, built with the coiled compactness of someone who had grown into authority early and never allowed himself to soften. His eyes were the pale amber of wolf gold, a characteristic of the Valdis line, she had read, in the bloodline records. They moved over her as she was brought to the standing position before the dais with the precision of someone assessing a document for accuracy. He did not look away when their eyes met. She did not look away either. This was not defiance. It was simply that she had learned, long ago, that the packless who looked at the ground were most easily forgotten, and right now, she did not want to be forgotten. She wanted every person in this hall to see her face. The charge was read by the council secretary, a thin man with a trembling voice that the high ceilings rendered somehow worse: spiritual contamination. The pre-accord language, the old rites, the particular kind of hearing that Ironhollow law had classified 3 generations ago as a symptom of spiritual instability. It had been used twice before in recorded Ironhollow history. Both prior charges had ended the same way. Then the witness was brought forward. Her name was Orla. She had worked in the records hall for 8 months, brought in to assist during the autumn document season. She had sat across the table from Thessaly for 8 months. She had borrowed Thessaly's spare candle on cold evenings. She had accepted the extra bread Thessaly had brought from the lower quarters kitchen when Orla arrived later than the meal hour. Orla did not meet Thessaly's eyes when she gave her testimony. "I heard her speaking," Orla said to the council. Her voice was steady with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided. "In the records room, on several evenings, words I did not recognize, not Ironhollow common tongue, not the old northern dialect, something else." "Did she speak to you directly?" the council secretary asked. "No. She appeared to be speaking to no one, or speaking to the air, as though someone was listening who the rest of us could not perceive." A murmur moved through the hall. Thessaly stood without expression and watched it move through the crowd the way one watches weather cross a hillside. She had not been speaking. She had been humming an old melody her mother had taught her before the council took her mother away. She had not known, until this moment, that the melody was anything other than a melody. She did not know it now, with certainty, but the fact that Orla was standing in the witness position meant someone had told her to stand there. Someone had explained to Orla what she had heard and what it meant. Someone had prepared this. The council member on the far left, a woman named Aldrich, who had been the one voice of hesitation when the charge was first proposed, according to what Thessaly had later pieced together, was gone. Her seat was occupied by a replacement who had not been there last month. No announcement had been made. The High Alpha spoke for the first time. "The position of records assistant within the Ironhollow Administrative Hall is a position of trust," Caerun Valdis said. His voice was even, without performance, the voice of a man who did not require dramatics because the power was already established. It provides access to documents of legal and historical sensitivity. Given the nature of this charge, that position is suspended immediately pending the outcome of these proceedings. Suspended, not returned, pending outcome. Suspended. The word had a direction to it. The secretary made a note. "The accused will be given opportunity to speak in her own defense." The High Alpha's pale eyes came back to her. There was something in them she could not name, not cruelty, not satisfaction, not even the usual indifference of the powerful toward the powerless, something more like calculation. The way one looks at a locked door and considers whether to find the key or remove the door entirely. "Thessaly of Ironhollow, you have heard the charge. You have heard the witness. Do you speak?" It was not framed as a question. The hall was completely still. Thessaly looked at the High Alpha. Then she looked at Orla, who had still not raised her eyes. Then she looked at the assembled court of Ironhollow, the pack born in their formal colors, the halves behind them, the packless standing at the back near walls they were not invited to lean against. She thought about the margin notation. Sally. She thought about what the archivist had told her. The one time he had found her in the hall alone and spoken quickly, and with the frightened efficiency of a man delivering a warning he had delayed too long. Say nothing. Whatever you do not speak the old prayers aloud. She was not sure yet if what she carried was a prayer. But she knew, with a certainty that sat low and still in her chest like deep water, that this trial was not designed to hear anything she said. Whatever words she offered would be catalogued and used. Silence, at least, could not be twisted. She did not speak. The hall exhaled. "Very well," said High Alpha Caerun Valdis, and he reached for his pen. Chapter 3. What Silence Costs. The holding cell beneath the Ironhollow administrative hall was clean. This was the detail that struck her most on the first night, cleaner than her room in the lower quarters. Stone floor, stone walls, a pallet that had been recently restuffed, a small window set high in the wall that admitted a rectangle of gray sky during the day and a smear of stars at night. The Packless had built this hall. She had read the construction records. She knew the names of the men who had cut the stone, and the names of the men who had been paid for overseeing them, and the fact that the two lists did not overlap. She sat on the pallet with her hands in her lap and let the first night pass. The guard who brought her water on the second morning was young, perhaps 18. With the wide-set eyes and careful movements of a boy who had not yet been in a position to cause harm and was beginning to understand that positions like this one might require it. He set the cup just inside the door and did not step across the threshold. He was not afraid of her, she thought. He simply was not certain what the correct distance was. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. He gave a short, awkward nod and withdrew. She drank the water slowly and watched the gray rectangle above her shift from dark to pale. On the afternoon of the first day, a priest came. He was an older man with a formal sash and the resigned air of someone who has conducted last rites often enough that the ceremony has become administrative. He stood inside the door and read from a text the standard consolation passages of the Ironhollow faith, the ones concerning the soul's passage and the mercy of the divine order and the peace that awaited those who had lived according to the accord. Thessaly listened to the words. She did not interrupt them. When the priest reached the end and looked up, clearly waiting for her to respond in the traditional manner, a phrase, a bow of the head, an acknowledgement of having heard, she simply looked at him. He shifted his weight. "It is customary," he said, with some delicacy, for the condemned to affirm the words. "I heard them," she said. "That is not quite—" "I heard them," she said again, with the same careful, unhurried weight. Every word. Something about the way she said it made him look at her for a moment as though he were trying to determine if she had said something more than she had said. He closed his book. He left. The second evening brought the Archivist. His name was Edric. He was old in the way that certain wolves aged slowly and then all at once, so that one day they looked worn and the next they looked ancient. He appeared in the corridor outside her cell, not through any official capacity. He had no authority to visit the holding cells, but through the particular access granted to very old men who had been useful long enough that the guards had learned not to question their presence. He stood at the barred door and looked at her and did not speak immediately. She waited. "I knew your mother," he said finally, not as an introduction, as a weight he was setting down. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She was not mad. "I know that too." The torchlight from the corridor cast his shadow long across the stone floor. "What she heard, what you carry, If you carry it, it is not madness and it is not contamination. It is something much older than either of those words. Something older than Ironhollow, older than the Accord. He paused. Older than the Valdis line. She felt something shift in her chest, not hope. She was careful not to let it be hope, but something adjacent to it, a stillness becoming less still. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I should have told you years ago and I was a coward." He said it flatly, without seeking absolution for it. "And because there is not much time, and there are things you must understand before—" A sound from the corridor. A guard's footfall, closer than it should have been. Edric's eyes went to the corridor and back to her. Something moved across his face, urgency, or fear, or the particular expression of a man who has realized he has less time than he calculated. He leaned closer to the bars. "Say nothing. Whatever you do, on that platform, do not speak the old prayers aloud." His voice was barely sound. Not a word, not a syllable. "Do you understand me?" "I do not know the old prayers," she said, equally low. "You do not need to know them," he said. "They know you." Then he was gone, moving away down the corridor with the unhurried pace of someone who had simply been passing through. The guard came around the corner, saw nothing unusual, moved on. Thessaly sat with Edric's words in the dark. "They know you." She turned her mother's name over in her mind, Lyrian. Small and ordinary and stripped of its context, turned into a cautionary example, turned into an explanation for a daughter's presence at the bottom of the hierarchy. She had said the name to herself every night since she was 7 years old. A small, private ceremony, a refusal to let a name become only what others had made of it. She said it once more now, silently, in the particular dark of a holding cell 2 days before an execution. Then she lay down on the clean pallet and waited for morning. Chapter 4. The Testimony of Useful Men. That same night, in the upper hall, the council ate by firelight. High Alpha Caerun Valdis sat at the head of the table. On his right, Lord Fenwick, who had been the one to surface the charge. On his left, the Northern Alliance representative, a wolf named Brennan Ashford, who had arrived from the Caldrath territories 3 weeks ago and had not yet left. Ashford had silver at his temples and the manner of a man who considered himself a guest but behaved like a landlord. He had been watching the Ironhollow proceedings with the patient satisfaction of someone who has ordered a meal and is waiting for it to be served. "The Northern families will be satisfied," Ashford said, "not for the first time this week. They've been watching Ironhollow for a generation, waiting to see whether the Valdis line has the resolution that the founding generation had." Caerun said nothing. He turned his wine cup in his hand. "Resolution," said Lord Fenwick, with the warmth of a man quoting something he believes. "The Consolidation Edict was written for exactly this reason. Bloodlines that predate the Accord that operate outside it, they destabilize everything we've built. One woman seems small, but she is a symbol. What we do with her tells every pre-Accord remnant in the Northern Territories how seriously we take our own law." "The council member for the Eastern District," Caerun said. "Aldrich." A brief stillness at the table. "She has been assigned to border review," Fenwick said. "The Eastern Post was understaffed, a natural redeployment." "Natural," Caerun repeated. The words sat at the table like something that had been placed there and not yet claimed. Ashford refilled his own cup with the ease of someone who does not wait to be served. "The records, too, will need to be addressed. If the girl was in the records hall for 4 years, if she had access to the founding documents, there may be material that requires revision before the proceedings are formalized." "The records are handled," Fenwick said. Caerun set down his cup. He looked at Fenwick with the particular attention of a man who is storing information rather than responding to it. "All of them?" "The relevant ones." Caerun looked at the fire for a moment. Then he picked up his cup again and did not pursue it further. Below, In the lower quarters, the woman named Orla sat alone at the table in her small room with the remains of a meal she had not finished in front of her. She had been given extra rations tonight. A small acknowledgement from the kitchen master of a task completed. She had understood immediately what it meant and had eaten the first few bites with the determined focus of someone eating to prove they deserve to. Then she had stopped eating. She sat in the quiet of her room and thought about Thessaly, who had shared her candle on cold evenings without being asked, who had found the misfiled documents before Orla could be blamed for their loss, who had, on 3 separate occasions, been the only person in the hall who acknowledged Orla's presence with anything approaching recognition. The thing Orla had told the council was accurate in its facts and completely wrong in its meaning, and she had known this while she said it, and she had said it anyway, because Lord Fenwick had come to her personally with very specific information about a debt her brother owed to a Pack-born merchant, and the manner in which that debt was presented had not felt like a conversation, but an instruction. She stared at her extra rations. The fire in her small room burned lower. She did not add wood to it. She sat in the growing cold and let herself understand what she had done, which was perhaps the only honest thing she would do in connection with this entire matter. Outside, the execution platform was being prepared. The work crews had begun at the 10th hour of evening, working by torchlight. She could hear the sounds of it from her window, the knock of timber against timber, the scrape of planking being leveled, the low voices of men doing a job that required no conversation but was uncomfortable enough that silence felt wrong. Fresh pine and cold air drifted in through the gap at the window's edge. Everything was in place. The Northern Alliance was satisfied. The council record had been adjusted. The one dissenting voice had been reassigned to a post 4 days' ride from Ironhollow. The trial had been witnessed by the full court, its outcome already entered into the formal log. There was no thread left to pull. By the time the torches below went out and the work crews retired, the platform was complete. It stood in the center of the courtyard in the dark, new wood pale against the old stone, waiting for morning. In the holding cell, Thessaly was already asleep. Every thread of mercy has been cut. Every voice that might have spoken has been silenced or sent away. What remains on that platform tomorrow morning is not a woman without power. It is a woman whose power no one thought to fear. Subscribe to Judy's romance library so her rise finds you. Now, let us not look away. Chapter 5. What the Archivist Left Behind. At the 3rd hour before dawn, the Archivist Edric was found in the records room. He was not murdered. He had not been struck or restrained. He sat upright in the chair at the primary records desk, as though he had sat down to read something and simply left. His hands were in his lap. His eyes were closed. The candle before him had burned to nothing, the wax pooled and solid on the holder, hours old. The junior records keeper who found him was a girl of perhaps 16 named Wren, brought in from the village the previous autumn as part of the hall's seasonal intake. She had not been given any particular instruction about what to do with an archivist found dead at his desk before dawn on an execution morning, because no one had considered this scenario sufficiently likely to prepare for. She stood in the doorway for a long moment with her candle raised and her mouth open. Then she looked at the desk. In Edric's right hand, loosely as though it had been slipped there after he sat down, or taken from somewhere and held until the holding was no longer possible, was a fragment of document. Old paper, the kind that had been processed with methods not used in 3 generations. Small, perhaps the width of a hand, written in a script that Wren did not recognize. She reached for it, then stopped. Reached again. Something about the fragment made her wolf. She had a partial shift, barely enough to count, more instinct than form, go very still. Not frightened still, the other kind, the kind that preceded certainty. She took the fragment and held it. The words on it meant nothing to her. But the fragment itself felt she would struggle. Later, to explain this, it felt like the moment just before a large sound, when the air has already changed, but the event has not yet happened. She did not know who to bring it to. She knew only that it should not remain here, should not be filed or catalogued or slipped under a door. So she did what people with no authority have always done in situations where authority has failed. She brought it to the person who seemed least likely to misuse it. She brought it to the guard captain, Wren, who was overseeing the execution preparations in the courtyard. Wren was a practical man, 40 years of pack service, 3 of them in the holding hall, none of them in circumstances he had not been adequately briefed on. He took the fragment from Wren, looked at the script, and felt his wolf do the same thing Wren's had done. He turned it over. He read the few marks on the reverse side, which were not the same script and appeared to be an Ironhollow notation, very old, in a hand he did not know. He could not make the notation out entirely, but one word was legible: Mothers. He held the fragment for a long time. His wolf had gone entirely quiet, not dormant, not absent, but listening in the way it listened before weather. He stood in the early dark of the courtyard, with the new platform behind him and the fragment in his hand, and the particular sensation of a man who has been given a piece of information without the frame that makes it make sense. In her cell, Thessaly was brought water by the young guard and was told to prepare for the proceedings. She washed her face with the water. She straightened her dress. She unbound and rebound her pale hair, then thought better of it and left it loose. Because it had been loose at the trial, and she had decided in the quiet of the second night that she would not alter a single thing about herself for what was coming. She would arrive on that platform exactly as she had arrived everywhere else in her life, with nothing offered, nothing adjusted, nothing surrendered. The courtyard was filling as she was brought through it. Wolves came as they had come to the trial in hierarchical order, formal colors, the alignment of people attending a sanctioned event. Some looked at her. Many did not. A few, she noticed, looked and then looked away with the particular speed of those trying to determine how much they had been seen looking. Captain Wren was standing to the left of the platform steps. She saw him as she was brought past. He was watching her with an expression she did not immediately understand, not the careful blankness of official function, but something more concentrated. He had something in his hand. He closed his fist around it when the escort passed. She climbed the platform steps. From the height of the platform, she could see the full courtyard, the assembled court, the guards at the perimeter, the administrative hall rising at the far end with its high windows. The sky above was the gray of old ash, of exhausted things, very much as she had imagined it would be. The High Alpha had not yet taken his position. The courtyard waited. In that waiting, something happened. It was not a sound. It was not a movement. It was the quality of the air, the way a room changes when something is about to happen that has been held back a long time. The wolves nearest the platform felt it first, the pack-born with their sharper senses. A few heads turned. A few wolves shifted their weight. One of the dogs in the far kennel began a low sound that was not quite barking and did not resolve into anything else. Thessaly stood on the platform and felt it too. Felt it begin. In the deep center of herself, the place below thought and below feeling. The place her mother had described once in the short period before the council took her away as the place where the old things live. She did not know what it was yet. But she was beginning to understand that it had been waiting a very long time for exactly this. Chapter 6. The Language Without Sound. High Alpha Caerun Valdis took his position at the base of the platform steps at the first full light of morning. He was dressed in the formal black of Valdis ceremony. No color, no ornamentation, a deliberate choice, she understood, designed to communicate austerity, authority without excess, justice without sentiment. He looked up at her on the platform. For just a moment so brief that only someone watching with full attention would have caught it, something moved across his expression. Not hesitation, something earlier than hesitation. The flicker of a question not yet formed. It passed. He gave the signal to the court secretary. The formal opening was read. The charge was repeated. The verdict was confirmed. The executioner, a large man in the Ironhollow neutral gray, face deliberately unremarkable, a professional, took his position. Thessaly stood bound at the wrists. Her pale hair was loose and moved in the early morning wind. She was looking at something past the edge of the courtyard, not at the high Alpha, not at the crowd. At something beyond both, in the direction of the old records hall, where the window of the room she had worked in for 4 years was visible as a dark rectangle in the gray stone. She was not afraid. This was the thing she would not have been able to explain to anyone. Later, not that she was brave, not that she had resolved herself to it, but that the fear simply was not present. It had been present in the cell on the first night, a cold and reasonable fear, the fear of a woman who understands what is happening. But by the second night it had receded, not through effort, through the same process by which the ground settles after a long rain, gradually, and then completely. What was present in its place was not peace. It was something older than peace. Something that did not have a common tongue word, but that her mother had gestured toward, once, with a phrase in a language Thessaly had not known was a language until now. The old prayers Edric had said, they were not prayers in the way Ironhollow used that word. They were not petitions to a power outside the self. They were something more like recognitions. The acknowledgement of what was already present, already true, already moving toward its own completion regardless of whether any living person said the words. Thessaly did not say them. She had held Edric's warning for 2 days, and she held it still. She would not speak them, not a word, not a syllable. But the silence itself, the particular quality of her silence, the silence of a woman who has kept everything inside for 23 years without bitterness or collapse, who has witnessed and remembered and endured without performing any of it for the benefit of those who caused it, that silence had a weight. It had a shape, and it had been building for a very long time. The executioner raised his axe. And the old prayers, which did not require her voice, which required only the weight of what she carried, and the particular moment in which the weight was allowed to be still, began, not in sound, in something beneath sound. The wolves in the courtyard felt it first as an absence, the cessation of the low ambient noise that living beings make without knowing they are making it. Breathing, heartbeats, the minor shifts of bodies in attendance. All of it went quiet, not through any action, not through command, but as water goes quiet when it becomes ice, a change of state, not of substance. Then the recognition began. The silent mothers, the matriarchal lineage whose name had been expunged from Ironhollow records 3 generations ago, whose existence had been reclassified as legend, whose last daughter had been declared mad and stripped of her name, were not a bloodline in the way Ironhollow understood bloodlines. They were not a transfer of wolf strength or shiftability. They were a lineage of witness. They carried in their blood the capacity to make visible what had been buried, to make felt what had been denied, to allow the full weight of a truth to settle onto the people who had built their authority on its suppression. What each wolf in the courtyard felt was not the same. The council members who had signed the execution order felt the specific gravity of that moment, the pen in the hand, the page beneath it, the faces of the people in the hall watching to see if they would hesitate. They felt it not as memory but as presence, as if that moment had been waiting for them here in the gray morning air. Orla, who had come to the execution because not coming would have drawn attention, stood near the back of the courtyard and felt the exact texture of 8 months of small kindnesses, candle sharing, bread, the quiet of another person working nearby settle into her chest with the full weight of what they had been worth. Her knees bent. She gripped the arm of the wolf standing beside her. She could not have said why. The Northern Alliance representative, Brennan Ashford, stood near the dais and felt nothing, for a moment. And then he became aware that he was feeling nothing, in a courtyard full of wolves who were visibly feeling something, and that this nothingness had a texture of its own, the texture of a man who had made his calculations so thoroughly and so long ago that the mechanism had replaced the person, and that this replacement was now, for the first time, apparent to him. He took a step backward without knowing he had done it. And Caerun Valdis, High Alpha of Ironhollow, standing at the base of the platform steps with his signal already given. Caerun Valdis looked up at Thessaly and could not look away. She was still, entirely still. The wind moved her hair. The morning light was gray and absolute on her face. Her eyes were not closed, and they were not burning with anything theatrical. They were simply open, and what was in them was the clear, deep, unperformable quality of someone who has spent 23 years seeing exactly what the world is and has never once flinched from it. He raised his hand. He almost brought it down. The word almost, the terrible geography of almost. His hand stayed raised. His mouth opened. The question he had not formed on the courtyard steps came now too late, as questions generally do. What is she? What does she carry? What have I? The executioner's axe came down. Chapter 7. The reckoning has no sword. The axe came down, and Thessaly did not die. Not through intervention, no wolf moved, no blade was deflected, no divine hand reached through the gray morning sky. The execution proceeded exactly as executions proceed. The axe was accurate. The executioner was skilled. The sentence was carried out to the letter of Ironhollow law. And it did not matter. The silent mothers had not been worshipped because they were powerful in the way that Valdis wolves understood power, strength, dominance, the hierarchy of force. They had been held in a kind of reverence older than pack law because they carried something that could not be legislated and could not be executed, divine witness. The recognition, once activated, could not be closed by the death of the body that had carried it. It did not require a living vessel. It only required to have been released. And it had been released. The courtyard understood this before any wolf in it could have articulated it. The understanding arrived the way the truth generally arrives in the bodies of beings trying to suppress it, not through reasoning, but through the physical impossibility of continuation. The council members found, one by one, that they could not speak, not struck, mute their throats worked, their mouths formed words. The words simply would not carry sound. The silence that Thessaly had carried for 23 years was now distributed among the people who had most required her to be silent, and it sat on their voices with the full weight of what it represented. The Northern Alliance representative took 2 more steps backward and then stopped, because there was nowhere that backward led that was not also part of what was happening. The crowd did not flee. They stood and felt what the courtyard had become, not a place of execution, but a place of accounting. The particular accounting that has no judge and no advocate because the evidence is not external, it is entirely interior. Each wolf in that court holding their own portion of what had been done and what had been permitted and what had been called justice. Orla sank to one knee in the gravel. She did not know she had done it until she was already down. Captain Wren opened his fist and looked at the document fragment. In the morning light, the script on it was suddenly legible to him, all of it, not just the notation, though he had no training in the old language and no reason to be able to read it. He read it anyway, the way one reads something that one already knows. It said, "She who is taken by a cord's law and does not speak her silence, is the prayer completed. What is witnessed by the divine blood is witnessed permanently. The record cannot be sealed." He closed his hand around it again. He looked at the platform. Caerun Valdis had not moved from the base of the platform steps. The courtyard was shifting around him, wolves turning to one another with no words. the formal arrangement of the execution audience collapsing into something less organized and more human, and he stood at the center of it, with the particular stillness of a man who has understood something he cannot ununderstand. His authority was intact. He still held every legal power he had held 1 hour ago. The pack still answered to him. The alliance terms were still written. The records had been adjusted, the dissenting voice reassigned, the charge properly filed. By every operational measure of Ironhollow law, he had done exactly what the law required. And the law had been built on a foundation that this morning had permanently revealed to be borrowed. He climbed the platform steps. He stood before her, before what remained on the platform, which was no longer a woman in a commoner's dress, but the undeniable evidence of 3 generations of erasure. And he stood there for a long time in the gray morning light with no audience of advisors, no counsel around him, no Ashford at his shoulder providing the architecture of justification, just the weight of what had been witnessed. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who has lost something he did not know he was relying on. Not power remained, something less tangible and more structural. The belief that the structure was clean. The charge, he began. He stopped. The words would not complete themselves. Not because the witness had taken his voice, it had not touched him the same way it had touched the council members. He was the architect, and the witness was specific. It had given him, instead, the full and permanent consciousness of what he had architected, and the particular impossibility of framing it in the language of law. He stood on the platform in front of the court of Ironhollow, and he could not finish the sentence. In the silence that his unfinished sentence created, the wind came up from the eastern fens and moved through the courtyard, and in 3 kingdoms away in the mountain passes of Caldrath, in the salt marshes at the border of the Thornwood, in the settlement at Ashmore where the elder pack mothers still kept a small fire burning on the nights when the old calendar said it was required, wolves lifted their heads. They did not know the name Thessaly. They knew what had been completed. Chapter 8. What remains when the noise is gone? 3 days after the execution morning, the Interpack Council convened on an emergency basis. It was the first time in 40 years that a meeting had been called outside the scheduled cycle. The wolves who came to Ironhollow found a pack that had not returned to ordinary functioning and was not yet certain how to begin. The Consolidation Edict, the 3rd-generation law under which Thessaly had been charged, was formally suspended pending comprehensive review. This was not presented as reversal. It was presented as procedure. The council communiqué, drafted in careful language, referenced a need to re-examine the historical context of the edict. It did not use the word erasure. It did not use the word wrong, but it was the first official document in 3 generations to acknowledge that there was a historical context to re-examine at all. Lord Fenwick resigned from the council on the 2nd day, citing illness. No one said otherwise. The Northern Alliance representative, Brennan Ashford, departed Ironhollow on the evening of the 1st day. He did not request a formal farewell audience with the High Alpha. He simply left his horses, his retinue, his careful posture of a man who considers himself a guest but behaves like a landlord, all of it removed from the courtyard before the 2nd bell. The alliance terms he had come to cement remained in a document on the High Alpha's desk. It had not been signed. It was not destroyed either. It sat there in its unsigned state, a document with ambitions that were now surrounded by different facts. Orla did not leave her room for 2 days. On the 3rd day she emerged and went to the records hall and asked if there was copying work. The hall was understaffed. She was put to work. No one said anything to her about what had happened, which was not comfort but was at least something she could occupy herself within. Captain Wren kept the document fragment. He did not file it. He did not report it. He placed it in the interior pocket of his uniform, where it remained, and where, on certain mornings when the air came in cold from the fens, He would find himself aware of it with the same quality of attention that he had given it on the execution morning, not as a document, but as evidence of something he was still in the process of understanding. High Alpha Caerun Valdis had not summoned his council advisors since the morning of the execution. He had not issued directives or communiques. He had managed the procedural necessities of the Interpack review with the formal efficiency of a man whose administrative competence remained intact while something else in him was conducting its own slower process. He knew what needed to be rebuilt. He was not certain yet how to begin rebuilding it without the foundation he had used before. This was the kind of problem that did not have a legal solution, and Caerun Valdis had spent his entire adult life learning to solve legal problems. The other kind, the kind that required a different architecture entirely, he was, at 40 years old, only just beginning to learn the dimensions of. Thessaly walked out of Ironhollow at dawn on the third day. She carried nothing. There was nothing of hers in the lower quarters that she required a few practical items, clothing she could replace, the tools of a record-keeper's assistant that had been the property of the hall. She had been given back the door of her room as a practical matter, the holding cell having no further procedural justification for her occupation of it. She had slept one night in her room. She had washed her face. She had straightened her dress. Then she had walked. At the gate, the young guard who had brought her water in the cell was on duty. He saw her coming and stepped aside without being asked, which was not protocol and was precisely correct. He looked at her with the expression of someone who wants to say something and has not found the right words and may not find them in time. She paused at the gate. "Thank you," she said, the same words she had said in the cell, meaning, in both cases, not what one might assume. He nodded. She walked through. The road out of Ironhollow ran east for a mile before it branched north toward Caldrath, south toward the Thornward border, east toward the fens of Ashmore. She walked the eastern branch without deliberation, the way one walks a direction one has known for a long time without having previously had occasion to take it. She did not look back. Not out of bitterness, not out of the kind of practiced dignity that requires effort. She simply had no further business with Ironhollow, and she walked as a person walks when the ground they are crossing is entirely behind them. Captain Wren had, before her release, pressed the document fragment into her hand. She had looked at it for a long moment in the early morning light. The script she could not have read 2 weeks ago was entirely legible to her now, all of it, every line, as natural as reading common tongue. She had read it once through. Then she had folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket at the side seam of her dress. She walked for an hour before she stopped. It was at the point where the eastern road crested a low hill, and the fens of Ashmore became visible in the middle distance, brown and silver in the early light, very old, very still. She stood at the crest of that hill with the wind coming off the fens and her pale hair loose around her, and she said her mother's name aloud. Lyrian. Not quietly, not as the private ceremony she had kept for 16 years. She said it at full voice, into the morning air, into the direction of the fens where the elder pack mothers had kept their small fire burning on the nights when the old calendar required it. Somewhere in Ashmore, something answered. Not in sound, in the way the air settled, the way a long-held breath is finally released, not in one place but in many, as though the name had been distributed across distance and received in all the places it had always been waiting to reach. Thessaly stood on the hill and let it settle around her. Then she walked on, into the fens, into whatever the old things that lived below thought and feeling were moving her toward, into a name that was, at last, nobody's cautionary example, her own. And so she spoke a name into the wind, and the world that had tried to bury it finally heard it. If her journey moved something in you, share this with someone who believes that dignity always finds its way home. Subscribe to Judy's Romance Library so the next episode never passes you by. Until we meet again, this has been Judy's Romance Library.